Good evening. I'm Bob Blackwell of the Kennedy School faculty, and I want to welcome you here this evening on behalf of the Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics. I'm your moderator for this evening's event. The purpose of this forum, and indeed every forum that we hold here at the Kennedy School, is to provide a venue for political speech, discussion, and debate, and we look forward to that tonight. As you know, our speaker this evening will be Gary Bauer, who will be speaking on the subject, A Conservative View of American Foreign Policy. Following Mr. Bauer's remarks, we will proceed to a question and answer period. I'll be the traffic cop, and we'll conclude the forum by 7:15. I have asked William Crystal to introduce Mr. Bauer. Bill Crystal, I think, as most of you know, is editor and publisher of the Weekly Standard, the influential journal of politics and ideas published in Washington. Before starting the Standard in 1995, Bill Crystal was chairman of the Project for the Republican Future. Prior to that, Mr. Crystal served as chief of staff to Vice President Dan Quayle during the Bush administration and Secretary of Education William Bennett under President Reagan. Bill Crystal is widely regarded as one of the country's leading political analysts. He appears regularly on Good Morning America, This Week, The News Hour with Jim Lehrer, and so forth. He has written broadly, both in the scholarly field and in the popular press, on political philosophy, American political thought, and public policy. Mr. Crystal earned a doctorate in political science from Harvard University and has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm delighted to say at the Kennedy School of Government, where we were colleagues. Bill Crystal is now a member of the Kennedy School Visiting Committee. Bill Crystal.
Well, thank you, Bob. It's good to have the excuse of introducing Gary Bauer to bring me back to Cambridge and to the Kennedy School, where I taught for a couple of years. I usually tell audiences that I was the token conservative at the Kennedy School, but that's unfair to Bob, who at least is partway there. Kennedy School likes to have one conservative on its faculty at all times, so the students know what one looks like for when they get out into the real world. It's actually unfair to the Kennedy School, which I will say, having taught elsewhere and having been around universities a fair amount, the Kennedy School is, I think, distinguished by the genuine commitment to diversity of opinion that it has. It's not to say that there might not be a predominance of one opinion here at the Kennedy School, but they really do try to expose students and faculty and each other to a variety of views. Diversity of opinion is the most important form of diversity, I think. Diversity is a fashionable topic these days. Diversity of opinion is a little less fashionable in universities than other forms of diversity, but I do think the Kennedy School really does set a model of diversity of opinion. It is also true, though, that when I tell people, especially conservative audiences around the country, that I taught at the Kennedy School and lived up here right outside Cambridge, they do tend to chuckle at the idea of a Reagan administration person being here. And I always do tell the story, which I could just tell for a second, and I'll clear the way for Gary, that when I lived here in '84, in November '84, I lived in Belmont, just down the road, in the 8th Congressional District, which was the district that included Cambridge. I think it still does. It was then Tip O'Neill's congressional district. He was Speaker of the House, a revered figure. Up here, obviously, totally safe Democratic congressional district. I remember in November '84, to give you a sense of, to give people elsewhere a sense of what politics up here is like, I remember voting in November '84 for Reagan for re-election to the presidency, and for the Republican Senate candidate running against John Kerry, who ran a pretty good race, the Republican, but lost, and voting for the Republican opponent to Tip O'Neill as a loyal Republican. And I remember the next morning, I knew that, of course, that Reagan had won. I knew the Republican opponent to Kerry had lost, and I was curious how many votes the Republican running against O'Neill had gotten. So I remember sitting there at breakfast asking, my wife had the Boston Globe, looking at the election tables, and I asked Susan, just out of curiosity, how many votes did the Republican running against Tip O'Neill get? And Susan looked at the Globe and kind of looked again and said, I hate to tell you this, there was no Republican running against Tip O'Neill. And I said, I know I voted for someone against Tip, and it turned out I had voted for the communist. This is a true story. A couple of months later, Bill Bennett asked me to come to Washington to work for him. President Reagan had asked him to become Secretary of Education. and I took a year to go work for him, and I had to have an interview in the White House. Gary and Bob remember this well. If you were a political appointee, you had to get political clearance, and the White House had to sign off on cabinet secretaries' choices. And I went for an interview with the deputy director of presidential personnel at the White House, a rather formidable lady named Becky Dunlop, a staunch Reaganite. And I was kind of nervous, and I was trying to make the point that I was a loyal Reaganite and a loyal Republican, and I told this, what I thought was amusing story about, I was such a committed Republican that I had tried to vote against Tip O'Neill, but unfortunately I had voted for the communist. And Becky Dunlop looked at me extremely sternly across the table and said, "Here in the Reagan White House, we don't consider it a laughing matter to vote for communists." Nonetheless, they let me go. So let me be very brief in introducing Gary Bauer, which is a real pleasure for me. Gary graduated from Georgetown College in Kentucky and then from Georgetown Law School in Washington, D.C., but wisely chose never to practice law, had a couple of political and private sector jobs, and then volunteered for the Reagan campaign in 1980, and ended up working for the entire Reagan administration, first in the White House, then at the Education Department, where I worked with Gary for 3 years. Gary was Bill Bennett's deputy secretary, and then finally as assistant to President Reagan for the last 2 years, domestic policy advisor to President Reagan, back in the White House. He then took over the Family Research Council, which at the time was a very small organization, and in the 9 or so years that he's run that, has built it up to a very effective, very influential organization, about 450,000 members, I believe. Our magazine, The Weekly Standard, had an article by Fred Barnes back in December calling Gary Bauer the most formidable conservative in Washington, and I think that was a analytically correct statement. A lot of other conservatives in Washington didn't think so, but they were wrong, and Fred was right. Gary has written 3 books, the most recent one of which, Our Hopes, Our Dreams, sold almost 500,000 copies. Just 2 points about Gary. When I was at the Kennedy School in the summer of 1984, a bunch of us flew down to Washington to do a study on political appointees. What makes a good effective political appointee? Why do so many of them seem ineffective at coming in from the private sector and helping to carry out the president's agenda? And we wrote a report. And that's when I first met Gary, because I didn't know who he was. He was, at that time, I think, the number 3 person in the Education Department, the Deputy Undersecretary for Planning and Budget. But several other people I had interviewed at the time, had called him to my attention. Most of the other people I'd interviewed were sort of moderate Republicans who were spending a lot of time trying to damp down the Reagan Revolution, and said to me that there was this one guy, most of the conservatives who came to town, they could handle. They'd figured out how to sort of pull the wool over their eyes or cause them to make mistakes and blow themselves up. But there was one guy who was a fierce, principled conservative, but also very effective. And his name was Gary Bauer, and I went to interview him, and I actually wrote this up in this little report, which is now moldering on the shelves of some Kennedy School office somewhere, about effective political appointees in Washington. But there really are rather few political appointees who are both principled and effective. There are lots of people who are effective and not principled. There are some who are principled and ineffective. I think Gary really was, throughout the 8 years of the Reagan administration, someone who had a rare ability to combine those 2 qualities, and it would be an interesting case study for the Kennedy School if anyone still wanted to do it. Last point about Gary Bauer, which is really a point my colleague Fred Barnes made. What Fred covered the White House when Gary was there in 87, 88, and said that he was struck by one quality of Gary's above all, and that was his courage. That he stood up for what he believed in privately, in private small meetings where there's lots of pressure to conform and not take on the chief of staff or other very influential people. In public, he stood up for what he believed in when there was lots of pressure to shade and to try to win the favor of the particular audience he was speaking to. And Fred, who has covered the White House an awful long time, said, and he wrote this in his piece, that this was truly an unusual quality to find in any White House, and that Gary really exemplified courage. Courage is a virtue too little studied, perhaps, by those of us in public policy and journalism, maybe too little studied even at the Kennedy School. Aristotle, I think, said it was the first of the virtues because it makes all the other virtues possible. So it really is a pleasure to give you tonight Gary Bauer, who will speak on a conservative Reaganite vision of foreign policy. He's an effective public servant, a dedicated public servant, and above all, a courageous public servant.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. That's very nice of you. Bill, that is a wonderful introduction. I deeply appreciate the kind words. What Bill could not say, of course, because it would have been inappropriate for him to say these things, is about what he did in the Reagan years when we served together at the Department of Education with Bill Bennett, and then later as Bill went on to advise Vice President Dan Quayle as his chief of staff. There could be great case studies done about courage by just looking at Bill Kristol's tremendous performance during those years. Once we got over the fact that Bill had voted communist, we found him to be a quite engaging person who really was dedicated to the conservative agenda. I've never told Bill this, but quite frankly, that is the first thing that I heard about Bill. I was already at the Department of Education. Bill Bennett was bringing Bill Kristol down. We heard vaguely that there had been some problem at the White House, and I remember one day saying to Bill Bennett, "What's the problem with this guy you're bringing down from Harvard?" And he said, "Well, apparently he voted communist." And I remember thinking at the time, gee, this doesn't seem like the sort of thing we ought to be doing at a Reagan Department of Education, but hey, Bill Bennett's a bigger intellectual than I am, and if he thinks a communist in the department is the right way to go, then I'm all for it. So in the years since then, Bill and I have become great, come to know each other, not only as colleagues in government and in politics, but as two friends, and that's been one of the great benefits of my years in Washington, D.C. It is a real pleasure to be here today, to spend some time with you. I do have to confess that I have some friends in Washington, and also my mother, who is visiting right now from Kentucky, who were quite dubious on me coming to Harvard. They just didn't quite see what the benefit would be of a Reagan conservative voluntarily coming to the Kennedy School of Government to talk about these issues. But I told those that were worried about it that the Harvard people that I know, Bill Kristol, Bill Bennett, Elliott Abrams, a number of others, all seemed to me to be good, strong conservatives. And I just assumed that reflected the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and I remain convinced of that unless I hear something otherwise tonight in the question and answer period. So I am really pleased to be here. Let me ask you something. How many of you actually subscribe to Bill's magazine, The Weekly Standard? Fantastic. In a very short period of time, Bill's magazine has become an incredible force in Washington, D.C. on the great issues of the day. It was remarkable for me to see how quickly people began to say with each issue that came out, did you see what Kristol did today in the Weekly Standard, or this week in the Weekly Standard? And so when that article appeared by Fred Barnes, in which I was on the cover, being called this very effective conservative, I was obviously, being a normal human being, very happy about that. What Bill did not mention to you is that on that cover, I was drawn in a Superman outfit. Now, if you've never seen me in tights, you have not missed anything. And this is not a theme that I want to continue to go on at any particular length of time. But being a normal human being, I look at the cover of the Weekly Standard. There, he's holding it up, absolutely. Looks at the cover of the Weekly Standard, in which I'm pictured in this Superman outfit, and I'm driving home that night, and my head is beginning to swell a little bit as I begin to think of Gary Bauer, political Superman. This is not bad. And I get home, pull into the driveway, and I open the door to my kitchen, and my wife, who was making dinner, turned and looked at the door and said, "Hey, Superman, it's garbage night." And as I was taking the cans down to the bottom of the driveway, it struck me that family is a really good thing to keep your feet on the ground and to remind you who exactly you are and what life is all about. Well, I came here tonight, as Bill has indicated, to talk about morality in American foreign policy. You know, for about 18 years now, 8 years with Ronald Reagan and 10 years since then, I have been most known for being part of the domestic public policy debate. And in that domestic policy debate, I have tried frequently to bring the debate down to moral first principles, principles like those that the Founding Fathers were so eloquent about. Often in these debates in Washington, I will try to remind those I'm debating with that the Founding Fathers believed that only a virtuous people could remain free. That was central to the American founding. It wasn't something there was much debate about. The founders believed they could give us limited government because virtue would restrain us from doing things we might otherwise be inclined to do. And I think that's a very important moral principle that we need to remember. Another moral principle that's been at the center of the public policy debate is that on domestic policy, we need to remember that the liberty the Founding Fathers imagined for us was not the liberty that said you could do whatever you wanted as long as it felt good. The liberty the Founding Fathers talked about was that ordered liberty under God, a quite different sort of liberty, a liberty that was quite different from the type of liberty we hear about today. And so with those two moral principles, I've reached over the years a number of conclusions about things like family policy and about teaching reliable standards of right and wrong, about what our schools ought to be doing, et cetera. And then in the last year or so, I attempted to get into the foreign policy debate. And again, my desire was to bring moral principles to the center of that debate. I think American foreign policy is, it only works if at its core it has a set of moral values. And I believe that just as family policy has to be built on moral ideas, so does American foreign policy. Well, let me begin, after having said that, with asking you to consider with me why it is, now that we're at the end of this century, and we're only, 17, 18, 19 months away from the beginning of a new century, why is it that this century is being called the American century? I think that's really an important question. I mean, we need to answer that question in order to know what to do in the next century. Is it because we've had great technological breakthroughs? Is it because of our medical breakthroughs, our space program, all the rest of that? Well, no doubt those things play a role in being called the American century, but I don't think in any way, shape, or form those are the major factors in that description. What about the triumph of democratic capitalism? Is that what's made it the American century? Certainly, in part, that's played a role. Democratic capitalism, I think, is winning the battle in the world between it and socialism. You know, all over the world, governments are finally beginning to learn the idea that socialism doesn't work, that in fact, free men and women able to invest and work and achieve to their highest capabilities are able to earn more, create more jobs, do more good things economically than any group of bureaucrats sitting in any nation's capital could ever hope to accomplish. Democratic capitalism has provided more jobs for more people than any system in the world, and certainly its triumph is part of this being called the American century. But I don't think that's the main factor either. I believe two things have made this the American century. First of all, the fact that America triumphed on the field of battle. And second of all, that American values, American founding values, have triumphed in this century. Now let's take the first one, triumphing on the field of battle. Twice since the end of World War I, the United States was called to do battle with the great isms of this century. First, Nazism in World War II. Now, I was born as that war was winding down. I don't have any firsthand knowledge of it. But sometimes late at night, if I prompted my father, he would tell me what he experienced in the 1st Marine Corps Division in the South Pacific during World War II. And as a young boy, he would tell me stories of the things that he saw and the things that he had to do in service to his country. Unbelievable things, things that I could not comprehend then and things that I can barely comprehend now. Sometimes over dinner, if I prompted my mother a little, she would talk to me about what it was like to be on the home front during World War II, to wake up on a sunny morning, and discover that your nation had been the victim of a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, and the fear and anxiety that Americans felt that we could actually lose the war, that we could lose our liberty in the process. But you know, as terrible as the event was of Pearl Harbor, as terrible as those days were, Winston Churchill wrote in his diary that he had the soundest sleep of the war the night after Pearl Harbor. Not because he was glib about it or because he thought it wasn't that big of a deal, but because Churchill believed that once the United States got into the conflict, that once we were in the war with the courage of our young men and our economic might and our military might, that there was no way that Hitler and his legions could prevail. Churchill referred to us as the American race, and I think he knew us better than we knew ourselves. He was absolutely right. Even though Americans couldn't see it at the time, Churchill was right in knowing that the outcome of the war was now clear to be seen. Well, World War II was no sooner over, and men like my father, millions of them, came home. They wanted to start careers. They wanted to start their families. Millions of them did. We had the baby boom. And yet, once again, the United States was called to meet a challenge. This time, it was that great stare down with the Soviet Union and Communist China that we all came to know as the Cold War. And once again, the United States stepped up to the plate. We drew a line in the sand in Europe and in Asia, and we said to the communists, this far and no further. We will be the watchmen on the tower for freedom. We will make the sacrifices that have to be made. That was a moral position the United States took. It was a foreign policy built on morality. And when we signaled to the world that we would make sacrifices not for our own gain, but to preserve liberty, we were making an incredible moral point that I believe ended up winning the Cold War. Now, in those years, we spent billions of dollars on weapons systems, on foreign aid, on all the things that had to be done to win the conflict. And I suspect that if that's all we had done, if only that money had been spent, that wouldn't have been any big deal. We're a rich country. We could have come up with the money. We could have made it up somehow. But we did something else. A succession of American presidents and American Congresses sent America's sons to places that at times seemed to be God-forsaken, places like Pork Chop Hill and Da Nang and Khe Sanh. And there, blood of our blood, flesh of our flesh, often paid the ultimate price for liberty. I believe when the history of this century is written, it will record that the sacrifices made by America's sons, not to conquer new territory, not to expand the boundaries of the United States, but sacrifices made for the liberty of others, was one of the most noble things that had been done in this century. And it was an important thing, and it mattered a great deal. Well, but you know, even that didn't make it the American century. It wasn't just that we had bombs and guns and ships and planes that were bigger and better and more powerful than anybody else. It wasn't just that we had young men willing to die for American ideas. It was also the fact that we had ideas, that American values were sweeping the globe. I don't mean the values of Hollywood. I don't mean our music and our pornography, one of our big exports right now around the world. I'm talking about the founding values of America. Those values are sweeping the globe. That's why the students in Tiananmen Square 8 or 9 years ago, when they stood up against their communist masters in Beijing, did not wave in front of those tanks copies of the sayings of Confucius. They waved copies of our Declaration of Independence. They built papier-mâché models of our Statue of Liberty. It was American values they were embracing. You know, when the communists took power in Cambodia, one of the first things they did was round up everybody that wore glasses and took them away, either killed them, imprisoned them, or put them in slave labor camps. Because you see, if you wore glasses, it meant you read books. And if you read books, they couldn't be sure whether or not your mind had already been infected with words like all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. There is not a tyrant in the world tonight, whether he's in Libya or North Korea, wherever he is, not a tyrant in the world whose head will rest easy on his pillow for fear that his subjects have already read those words. Those are the defining words of the American experiment. The founders didn't say all Americans are created equal. They didn't say all colonists are created equal or all Englishmen are created equal. It was a universal vision. It was a moral vision, and it was meant to apply to the whole world. Well, we've been having this debate over morality and realism in American foreign policy for a long time. In fact, not long ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of one of the great moments in American foreign policy, a speech delivered right here at Harvard by Secretary of State George Marshall, a Harvard graduate, gave a commencement address here in June of 1947. And Marshall, in that speech, us having vanquished Germany and its allies, Marshall said that America would now help to rebuild our former enemies. And he said something else. He said, any country that wants to be partners with us in that, we welcome you. But listen to what else he said. Those governments, political parties, or groups which seek to perpetuate human misery in order to profit from that politically or otherwise will encounter the opposition of the United States. A very important statement, a statement of moral principle. Marshall came here to Harvard not only to make a pledge, but also to persuade the American people that this was a moral commitment that they had to make. And so America set out to work, rebuilding where only 2 years before we had destroyed. I believe such resolve has always marked the best moments in American foreign policy. It has always reflected a uniquely American calling. After World War II, Pope Pius XII said this about us. The American people, he said, have a great genius for splendid and unselfish actions. Into the hands of America, God has placed the destinies of an afflicted mankind. Now, as a moralist in American foreign policy, I believe he was absolutely right. And I believe what he said about our calling should be something that we have to keep in mind as we determine what American foreign policy will be. You know, realism and morality are not mutually exclusive. The true realists are those who understand that American foreign policy must be guided above all by moral principles. America is, in my view, a nation with a calling. America's prime purpose in the world should be not only our own national defense, but to advance and protect the cause of freedom. I don't think this is utopianism. I don't think it's some starry-eyed view of faraway crusades. I believe it's a view born of the deepest and most profound kind of realism, and more than that, it is key to American history. And I believe it has got to be the center of American foreign policy now. You know, Teddy Roosevelt, another graduate of Harvard, class of 1880, he also gave voice to this moral idea in American foreign policy. Roosevelt said that nothing would more promote iniquity than for the free and enlightened peoples deliberately to render themselves powerless while leaving every despotism and barbarism armed. Now, those are moral terms. Evil, barbarism, iniquity, despotism, rights, greatness, freedom. And Teddy Roosevelt saw them as moral terms. He saw American foreign policy in that way. And of course, there was another Roosevelt, another Harvard man, FDR, who found himself needing to apply those principles. Faced with the isolationism that was abroad in the land, Roosevelt stepped up to the plate and made a very moral case for American foreign policy. Roosevelt said the following: "We will accept only a world consecrated to freedom of speech and expression, freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, freedom from want, freedom from terror." Again, those are moral terms: terror, freedom, worship, and even consecration. If you go forward from D-Day, you will find FDR declaring a national day of prayer, calling upon God to see our troops through in the great trial that they faced. So again, this moral theme has always been there. It is that moral theme that led conservatives in 1976 to draft a platform plank in the Republican platform that was entitled Morality in American Foreign Policy. Morality in American Foreign Policy. Now, the realists saw the title of that plank and they were mortified. You don't say things like that. You don't talk about morality in American foreign policy. That might offend the Soviets. That was counterproductive. That was unsophisticated. That was unrealistic. Of course, Reagan didn't get the nomination in 1976, but he went on to get it in 1980. And it ended up that plank that was drafted in 1976 by Reagan delegates to the convention was just a first draft of the plank that would be drafted in 1980 that Ronald Reagan would run on. A plank that would determine how he would conduct American foreign policy. You know, in 1977, President Carter went to Notre Dame University to lecture America about what he called our inordinate fear of communism, a fear that he eventually overcame with that now infamous kiss of Brezhnev's cheek during one of the summit meetings. 4 years later, Ronald Reagan went to Notre Dame and stood at a lectern and said the following: "The West won't contain communism. It will transcend communism. It will dismiss it as some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written." And I have to confess to you that in 1981, when I read those words by Ronald Reagan, I had no idea what he was talking about. I mean, what in the world could he mean? Transcend communism? They had 30,000 nuclear warheads aimed at us. Ronald Reagan wasn't making a point about warheads. He was making a case about a moral conflict between two competing visions in the world. One that recognized rights that every human being has that comes from God. Another one that believed that governments could do anything it wanted with people in the search for greater and greater power. From the late 1950s right up to 1989, Ronald Reagan had one central idea, and that was to liberate Eastern Europe from communism. He talked about rolling back the tide. He talked that way even when his critics dismissed his words as dangerous and irresponsible. What other president would ever have delivered a major foreign policy statement, the famous Evil Empire speech? And you know where he gave the speech? He gave it in Orlando, Florida, before the National Association of Evangelicals. And in the speech, he said the following: "Let us pray for the salvation of those who live in totalitarian darkness. Pray they too will discover the joy of knowing God. But until they do, let us be aware that while they preach supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual men, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples of the earth, they, in fact, are the focus of evil in the modern world." Now, I don't know how many of you remember what the reaction was to that phrase when Ronald Reagan dared to say that the Soviet Union was the focus of evil in the modern world. Enlightened opinion in this country and throughout the Western world came down on him like a ton of bricks. Every major newspaper in the country railed against that language. Professors at this university took to their classrooms to say that this was an outrage. 6 years after Ronald Reagan gave that speech, he said farewell at the White House to the White House staff. And he said at that time, "We came here to change a nation, and we ended up changing the world." Ronald Reagan knew this was a moral struggle. He knew that American foreign policy had to be built on moral ideas. Now, with all this recent history, you would think that the realism-morality debate might be seen in a little bit of better light right now. It was, after all, realism that found itself stuck in the mire of containment and détente. It was moral vision that ended the Cold War. It was realism that went to Moscow and kissed Brezhnev on the cheek. It was moralism, morality, that went to Berlin and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The realistic view turned out to not only be morally empty, it turned out to be ineffective. And the view built on morality ended up winning the Cold War. Well, in spite of the lessons of that, I think we are suffering, not Ronald Reagan, that we are suffering right now from Alzheimer's when it comes to remembering the lessons that he taught us about how American policy ought to be conducted. And I think the best example of how we are suffering from Alzheimer's is in the current American policy toward China. I took a major role in that debate last year, as many of you probably know. And I have to tell you that I believe right now in Washington, D.C., the leadership of both political parties are acting morally bankrupt when it comes to our Chinese policy. We are acting as if the highest American value is trade. Now, I'm in favor of trade. Economic activity is good. Economic exchanges between countries is a good thing, but it is not the most important thing. It is not the highest American value. And I believe we better get a Chinese policy devoted to morality in foreign policy very soon. Now, I'm already running over. I want to have time for you all to ask me some questions. Let me just try to summarize a couple of quick things. I believe there ought to be three principles in American foreign policy. First of all, I believe America is called to use its power abroad and to use it wisely to promote freedom, and that obligation, if anything, is greater now that the Cold War is over. Number two, I believe America's foreign policy and our domestic policy are morally inseparable. What we do abroad will always reveal what we are at home. And third, as I've already said, I believe that while foreign trade is important, it would be a terrible mistake to make it the most important goal of diplomacy. Trade ought to follow the diplomacy, not diplomacy following trade. With those three principles, I'm in favor of expanding NATO. I don't think there can be any question about that. I think we have to deny and defeat the isolationist voices that would have us withdraw from the world scene. I believe we need to take another look at the American defense posture right now. I think the defense cuts of the last 6 or 7 years are cutting too deep. I think the things we have been able to do in the world in recent years, we've been able to do because of Ronald Reagan's defense buildup. And if we want 8, 9, 10 years from now to be a force for good around the world, then we need to be making defense decisions now that will enable a future American president to be that force for good. And I would add that a major part of our relook at American defense ought to be, from a moral standpoint, ought to be to deploy the technology that we already have to defend the citizens of the United States from a missile attack from abroad. We have the technological capability to do that at a time when rogue nations are getting their hands on missile technology and nuclear technology. It is immoral to leave the American people defenseless from an ICBM fired at one of our major American cities. I think also in the area of the Middle East, again going rapidly now so we can have some time to talk, I believe that peace in the Middle East cannot be achieved by means of legalisms and diplomatic gestures and good feelings. It will be achieved only by a strong and inviolable Israel in concert with a powerful and resolute United States. And I am shocked that the American State Department right now acts like a neutral in the conflict in the Middle East. I think we have to remake our commitment to Israel, and we also have to make our commitment to freedom not only relevant to the rest of the world, but relevant to the Arab people. You know, we deal with people like Assad and Saddam Hussein, and we act like they are legitimate representatives of the Arab people. We act like the Arab people don't yearn for freedom as much as others do. We ought to be taking our message of freedom and liberty and democracy to all peoples of the world, including the Arab people of the Middle East. That is the best hope not only for us, not only the best hope for the Arab people of the Middle East, but the best hope for Israel. Finally, let me take a few moments to talk again about China. We have been hearing over and over again in Washington, D.C., that continued economic activity and the way that it's being conducted right now with China will change China. I believe the evidence is growing that our current type of economic activity, which continues no matter what Chinese policy is, that economic activity, in fact, is changing America more than it's changing China. It's making us forget our most deeply held values. It's making us forget who we are. You know, when you see on the front page of the New York Times today a story, I think an incredible scandal, of American corporations, Loral Corporation, Hughes Aircraft, transferring American technology, much of it developed with subsidies from the American people, and transferring that technology to the Chinese in order to make a few more bucks, in order to get a few more openings in the marketplace. That is a scandal. Last year, I was right in the middle of the debate on most favored nation status for communist China. And when we were in the middle of that debate, there were those on Capitol Hill, including many of my Republican friends, who said, Gary, you can't have this black blanket sanctions on China. It will cause a spiraling decline in our relationships. The sanctions have to be targeted. Okay, I'm willing to take them up on targeted sanctions. Let's take a look at the trade between the United States and those Chinese companies owned lock, stock, and barrel by the People's Liberation Army. A significant portion of the trade we have with China right now is not with freestanding commercial enterprises. It is with the same army that runs the slave labor camps, with the same army that is engaged in the middle of a massive arms buildup in order to dislodge the United States as the predominant power in the Pacific. There is something morally unacceptable on its face for us to be doing business with companies owned by the PLA, buying from them goods made by slave labor, by people that are in jail because they insist on practicing their religion, or they insist on demanding the political freedom that everybody in this room takes for granted every day. When those students stood up in Tiananmen Square and waved copies of our Declaration of Independence and were willing to die for those principles, it seems to me that the foreign policy elites in Washington, D.C. should be at least as committed to defending American values as those Chinese students were. The measure of America is being taken right now in our Chinese policy. I hope we can get that policy in order. Let me wrap up by saying that in the low point in the 60-year struggle that we had with first Hitler and then later with communism, Winston Churchill looked at the ruins of the British Parliament and he asked a question. What kind of people, he asked, do they think we are? He was speaking not just for England, but for the free world, and soon the answer would be made clear. It took another couple of generations of bloodshed and suffering and heroism, but we answered the question. That was always the question of questions in the Cold War. For people and nations alike, adversity is always a moral interrogation. What do we believe? How strong is our belief? What kind of people are we? It's the same question that's being asked today. I'm going to do everything I can in the months ahead to not only come to places like Harvard, but to go back to Washington, D.C., and argue that America's founding values, our moral values, ought to be at the center of American foreign policy, and that is the only option we have if indeed we are going to be that shining city upon a hill that the Founding Fathers attempted to give to us so many years ago. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, goodness. Thank you.
I was going to ask that you line up at the microphone, but I see we have veterans of the forum here who have already done so. May I ask you, in asking your question, to identify yourselves and your affiliation? And may I also request that you ask real questions and not make statements, long statements, and then say, do you agree? So, real questions. We'll start over here and we'll go back and forth between the two. Please.
My name is Jared Genzer. I'm a Master in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. I want to thank you, first of all, Mr. Bauer, for coming. I'm delighted to hear that there actually is something that I agree with you with. It's a little bit surprising to me, but I'm delighted to actually have a chance to interact with you in person. My question is in relation to the realism morality debate that you were talking about with regards to the United States policy towards China. First of all, I thought you might be interested in hearing that Wei Jingsheng is going to be coming and speaking here in the forum on May 6th.
Fantastic.
And I think it's interesting to get him involved in this debate as well.
Absolutely.
But I was curious as to your perspective on the United States withdrawing its condemnation of Chinese policy on human rights issues, particularly given the downward spiral that at least I see, or my perception is, with regards to U.S. self-censorship, that at a certain point we're so afraid of interacting with China on human rights issues that we are now censoring our own activities in interacting with them. And I was curious as to what you thought could be done to push the current administration on this issue.
Sure. Well, I think it's shameful. I mean, the last round of this that was debated at the UN, it was left to little Denmark to lead the effort to condemn Chinese human rights abuses. Extraordinary. Denmark. And when they did this, the Chinese government said, we will crush you. They literally said this, we will crush you like a bird or a canary eventually. And I thought, where are the great Western powers of Europe that they would allow Denmark to lead the argument? And then lo and behold, this year, the United States goes AWOL on this issue. I mean, not only are we not going to do anything on trade policy, we're not even willing in a human rights forum at the United Nations to stand up and be counted on this. I think it sends a terrible signal to the Chinese. I think the one thing the Chinese have said in recent years that unfortunately may be true is that we are acting like a money bags democracy. We are acting as if money is the most high American value. And I think it's a scandal. Now, I don't believe under other circumstances that the Clinton administration would be getting away with this if my party that controls the House and Senate found its voice on the matter. That is, in my view, Newt Gingrich and Trent Lott and a lot of other people ought to be banging on the table about this. They ought to be reminding the American people every day that this administration has turned their backs on the suffering people of China. I don't know anything else we can do other than continue the pressure of public policy. And I think Harvard, with its tradition over the years of standing for human rights, ought to be the center of that. I would like to see this campus put this issue front and center in the months ahead. If you do, I might even come back a few times. By the way, is that what you agree with me on, China?
Yes, it is.
I hesitate to ask. I'm glad I was able to hit something.
I appreciate it.
Sir.
Mr. Bauer, the modern conservative...
Can you identify yourself, please?
Sorry, Ted Halstead, mid-career at the Kennedy School. The modern conservative movement is built on an uneasy alliance between social conservatives like yourself and laissez-faire economic libertarians. My question for you is, what do you see as the potential for realignment over the next 10 years between social conservatives and a more progressive strand of economic thinking, specifically on issues of the growing inequality of wealth and opportunity in America? As you well know, there are very strong moral and religious underpinnings to the cause of greater economic inequality, yet this is something that the GOP seems to ignore. And I think you yourself have hinted at this realignment through your principal stance against privatizing Social Security. So my question is, what's the future of that?
I was wondering where that person was that agreed with me on Social Security. I'm glad I found him here at Harvard. But look, I have to tell you that in all my years working in the Republican Party in Washington, D.C., the one thing that I get most irritated about is that sort of subtle message the party periodically gives me that I have no place to go. That is, that I better fall in line with whatever the line is at the current moment, because I certainly can't go into the Democratic Party where social values are much more liberal on many of the things that I care about. I think my Republican friends are miscalculating about that. I think there's a lot of realignments that are possible in American politics. I know at the Family Research Council in recent months, we've been sitting down with inner-city evangelicals, many of whom vote Democratic, trying to find common ground on a host of issues. I think there are some possibilities, at the very least, for temporary alliances on some of these issues. And I think it would be good for the country and, quite frankly, good for the political system if things became a little bit more unpredictable in the weeks and months ahead. And if I can help contribute to that in some small way, I think I'll give it a shot.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My name is Byron McLean. I'm a sophomore at Harvard College and originally from New Orleans, Louisiana. Rumor has it that you're considering running for the Republican nomination for president in 2000. And if this is so, I was curious to know how you would distinguish yourself from some of the other more conservative candidates, such as Senator Ashcroft from Missouri and former Vice President Dan Quayle.
Right. Well, news spreads quickly. I am thinking about it. I'm thinking about it because, quite frankly, I grew weary over the last couple of election cycles trying to put my words into the mouths of people who, at the end of the day, I was convinced really didn't believe them. I don't know about some of the conservatives in the audience, but I ran out of shoes to throw at the television set during the last round of presidential debates. It just seemed to me that there was one lost opportunity after another. And I do believe the greatest vacuum in American politics right now is the vacuum that's been left by the absence of Ronald Reagan from the national scene. And much to my surprise, I don't see many people out there that want to pick up that mantle. That mantle of smaller government, lower taxes, a foreign policy built on morality, a strong national defense, et cetera. I'm going to take the rest of this year traveling around. Before I came to spend this time with you all this evening, I went to New Hampshire this morning and spoke at a luncheon there and did some interviews, and I suspect I'll be making some additional trips to New Hampshire in the weeks and months ahead. And at the end of the year, if I don't see somebody effectively making the case on these issues, then I may take a leave of absence and set up an exploratory committee. As far as the other conservatives that you mentioned, Dan Quayle's a fine man, so is John Ashcroft. I don't want to critique them in any way, but I don't really see someone right now that's willing to put these issues at the center of their campaign. I want a national debate, for example, on what I've been calling the virtue deficit. I'm glad we've made progress on the budget deficit, but I believe the virtue deficit is going to bring America down a lot more quickly. And so I would like a national campaign about what's happening to America's families. Why do we pick up the newspaper in the morning and open it up and see stories about kids in Arkansas sitting in the woods and shooting other kids as if they were, target practice? Why do you open up the paper and see a story about a girl in New Jersey giving birth in the ladies' room and throwing her baby in a trash can and then going back in and requesting her favorite song? I mean, these seem to me to be very important matters. And I don't understand why we have presidential races and we never have discussions about these things, about what's happening to the heart and soul of the country. We have a lot of discussions about the stock market and about marginal tax rates, and those are important things. But I think these are more important things. And unless I see somebody willing to devote a campaign to them, I must tell you I'm tempted to do it myself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
My name is Scott Boulay, and I'm a second year here at the Kennedy School. And speaking of the heart and soul of this country, I find it ironic to hear you invoking phrases like all men are created equal, or talking about things like fighting Nazism, since the Nazis supported the persecution of gays and lesbians, just like your organization supports the persecution of gays and lesbians. And my question is, does your vision of American foreign policy include this type of bigotry and hatred spreading throughout the world?
That wasn't a loaded question, was it? I want to make sure that there is, and this is, as a Harvard student, I'm sure you're going to be able to understand this. There is a difference between opposing the political agenda of the gay rights movement and being an oppressor of gays. The way that you choose to live your life or that others choose to live their lives is up to you. But when you come into the public square and suggest that the rest of America needs to redefine marriage as being between two men and two women, or when you come into the public square and insist on the right in the public schools of America to teach my children that the way you've chosen is no morally different than the way I've chosen to live with my wife, you should, in a rational, reasonable world, expect opposition. And I will, in fact, oppose that agenda, and no amount of name-calling will deter me from doing that.
I'm Jacqueline Newmeyer. I'm a freshman at the college.
Hi.
You spoke about a virtue deficit, and it seems to me that the country is also suffering from an attention deficit, at least where foreign policy is concerned. And I was wondering, clearly by framing foreign policy issues in moral terms, you help bring them to the attention of citizens. But I was wondering what role politicians and world leaders have in making sure that citizens are concerned and therefore voice their opinions and promote democracy here as well as abroad.
No, well, you're absolutely right. There is an attention deficit right now on this matter. Things are going well economically. People obviously watched the Soviet Union unravel. I think in some respects there was sort of a collective sigh by the American people that the worst was over, that there wasn't much that we had to be concerned about right now. And I do think that our leaders in Washington are failing in a very important responsibility to talk about the foreign policy challenges we face around the world. I still don't believe that President Clinton has really effectively outlined why we ought to be in Bosnia and what we're trying to do in Bosnia. I happen to agree with the policy there, but I do not believe he has used the power of his office to explain that policy. I think on the issues that have been brought up earlier on human rights violations in China, I think we look to our presidents, to our senators, to our congressmen to talk about those issues and explain to the American people how those developments in China ultimately will have an impact on us as China attempts to dislodge us from the Pacific. So I think there's a tremendous responsibility here, and I think the leadership in Washington is selling the American people short. They can comprehend a discussion on American foreign policy. Ronald Reagan proved that, and I think we need to appeal to the better instincts of the American people and have another one of those conversations now.
My name is Myung Lee, and I'm also a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. I want to press you a bit on your answer to the second prior question, which concerned oppression within this country of gays and lesbians, among many other groups of people. And I wanted to draw particular attention to the policies which the Family Research Council and other conservative groups are proponents of, which have to do with ex-gay conversion therapy. And I wanted to inform the audience that there's a quote from the Family Research Council's webpage that says, I quote, "The Family Research Council applauds the efforts of men and women who provide counseling and support for people who wish to leave homosexuality and find fulfillment in a healthy lifestyle." Now, leaving aside the highly suspect premise that these practices are actually effective at anything besides spending a lot of reasonable people's money, or for that matter, unreasonable, if they choose to engage in these policies, I do want to call particular attention to certain situations which I think are indistinguishable from oppression. Namely, there are children who are taken from their beds at night at the direction of their parents to be shuttled off to camps throughout the country where they are subjected to things like aversion therapy, including electric shock therapy. And in my mind, and I hope in other reasonable people's minds, these are very, very similar and within the umbrella of oppression. So I'd like to challenge you on that and say, from my perspective, it seems like you favor the cessation of oppression, which as I do, of Christians and other religious worshipers overseas and in China in particular. But I want to know whether you favor human rights for people that you agree with and tend to like, and discard them for people that you don't like.
Well, you've got me on electric shock therapy. I promise you I'll go back to Washington. Generally speaking, I'm not a fan of electric shock therapy for anyone, although I can think of a few politicians in Washington who might benefit from it. But look, you all have a problem, I think. When you belittle the idea that people can get out of the homosexual lifestyle, your problem is those people exist. I spoke at their convention just a few weeks ago. There were hundreds of them, now happily married, now with families of their own. I mean, it seems to me that if you're talking about oppression, I can't think of a greater oppression than to try to force somebody to continue to live the way apparently you and some others here are living. Again, if that's your choice, you'll bear the consequences of it. But how you can be against somebody else trying to get out of that way of life, if they choose to do so, and find happiness some other way, is bizarre to me. I will encourage anybody I can to get out of what I think is a destructive lifestyle. And I don't believe a healthy society can endorse it, subsidize it, or encourage it. I'm sorry if this disappoints you, but again, on this, I am immovable.
I think that history will shame you, Mr. Bauer.
My name is Raphael Mandelman. I'm a first year at the MPP at the Kennedy School. And I guess I'm the third of the trio. You responded, you talked about the gay political agenda, and I hope there's an organized agenda. I would feel better if there were. You raised marriage and schooling as two things that you find particularly objectionable. I want to ask you about two other things, which are that in many states in this country I can be arrested and sent to jail for spending the night with another man. And that in many states of this country, in all states of this country except for, well, no, that's not true. In many places in this country, I can be fired for being gay. And I'm curious if those are two areas where you think the gay political agenda, which tries to make non-discrimination against gays in employment, the law, and seeks to repeal sodomy laws, are particularly objectionable as well.
Well, I'm a federalist at heart, and I believe that states have a right to, in their laws and in their codes, to decide which sexual activity they want to discourage in a variety of ways. On the question of discrimination on homosexuality in the workplace, I think it would be a terrible mistake to add conduct to civil rights codes. The civil rights laws are clear. Courts have interpreted those laws in a certain way to include everything from affirmative action to set-asides, to quotas, et cetera. It would be a disaster to take something like conduct, homosexual conduct, and attempt to fold it in to the rubric of civil rights laws that we have. I would not want to force a church, for example, or a Christian bookstore, or a small businessman to have to hire somebody if he found out that the way that person was living was morally offensive to him. I don't believe a landlord should be forced to rent to somebody who is engaged in activity in an open way in an apartment or rental unit that is offensive to that person that owns the apartment unit. These are going to be things that we're going to debate. I suspect at the end of the day, those things will not be as controversial. Some states you'll probably have some political success. In other states, I think my side will win. But I do not believe your movement will be successful in the broader question of redefining marriage, of elevating this lifestyle to moral equality with the heterosexual family, or in some of the other, I think, very bold things that are on your agenda that I just don't believe the American people will embrace. They didn't embrace it in Maine, and yet all the polls showed that you all would win that election. They haven't embraced it in a lot of other cities. When the American people get a chance to vote on this directly, 9 times out of 10, they come down on the side of traditional values, and I believe they'll continue to do so.
Sure. Would you mind if I change the subject?
I would love for you to change the subject.
Mr. Bauer, my name is Dan Schnur. I'm a visiting fellow at the Institute of Politics from
Dan.
the state of California. And I am a conservative who agrees with your thoughts on both China and the Middle East, and a Republican who agrees with, although you didn't talk about it here tonight, with your support for parental consent and your opposition to partial birth abortions. And it is the latter issue that my question involves.
Sure.
In my home state of California, as you may have heard, there was recently a special election for a congressional seat on the Central Coast.
Right.
And the defeated Republican candidate, Tom Bordonaro, believed that the advertisements run both by your organization, but also in fairness by the National Abortion Rights League and others, changed the subject of the campaign from issues on which he felt he could have won, taxes and jobs and crime and welfare and so on, to an issue base that he was not able to win. I guess my question is given Mr. Bordinaro's thoughts on the race, and given the fact that he'll be running again in November against Ms. Capps, do you plan to run ads again in the race? And why or why not?
Sure. Well, I'm sympathetic to Mr. Bordinaro's concerns in this area. In all due respect to him, I don't think that my $100,000 advertising campaign had very much to do with him losing. There were a number of factors there. He had a $300,000 advertising campaign against him run by the term limits people because he wouldn't sign term limits pledge. Not only that, he was running against a widow. And if there's one sure thing in American politics, a widow who runs for her husband's seat has won 37 out of the last 38 times. So he was really swimming upstream in that regard. But I think even more importantly, the only reason that my $100,000 ad campaign could have kept his message from getting out is that, in my view, there is significant evidence that he was not fully funded by the Republican Party to get his message out. There's something wrong when the only advertising on television was the advertising I was running on his behalf. I think there was some evidence that the party had mixed emotions about a strong social conservative like Mr. Bordonaro winning that election. I even think there were some elements of the party that were hoping to teach me a lesson by trying to prove that a candidate I supported in California couldn't win. Having said all that, we'll look at that race and a number of other races as we get closer to November. It may be that I've become such a controversy in that district that it would be hard for me to be involved this time and still have a good outcome. But we'll weigh all of that and try to make the best judgments on how to move the conservative agenda forward in that district and other places.
Just as a very quick follow-up,
Sure.
and I apologize.
No, that's okay.
But you and the organization will weigh the preferences of the candidates in the races in question as you make those decisions in the fall.
Well, you know, this is interesting. We can find out the preferences of the candidates from hearing from people like you, but under the law, I cannot actually talk to the candidate. Once I do an independent expenditure, the law prohibits me from having any contact with the candidate at all. So I didn't even congratulate the man when he won the primary, nor did I call to offer condolences when he lost, because I assumed somebody would make something out of those phone calls. But I have heard through the grapevine, and now I've heard at Harvard, that he wishes my message hadn't blanked out his message, and so that's certainly something that we'll think about as we look at that race in the future.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have time for 2 more questions. Please, over here.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Wood, and I'm a student at Harvard College.
Hi, Sarah.
This weekend, when I was home for Easter, I had the opportunity to hear a woman speak who's been a missionary in China for the past 10 years, sponsored by the Southern Baptist Convention, and was surprised by some of the things that she shared out of her experiences, which pointed to a picture of China and of Chinese Christians and the Christian movement in China to really exercise increasing degrees of religious freedom and agency to organize and worship. And her sentiment was that there was a great possibility for Chinese Christians to do this within the confines of the law, and that frequently where problems were arising were with groups who were either foreign-sponsored or unrecognized by the China Christian Council, and that somehow these groups were causing Chinese Christians to receive a bad name, and that by having a lot of foreign press and concern about human rights abuses, that was actually impairing the efficacy of China's Christians to worship and to gain religious freedom, and
Right.
I wondered how you responded to this.
Well, I've heard the argument before. I obviously don't know the lady you're talking about. I'm sure she's a fine and decent woman and has dedicated her life to the cause of Christ, and for that my hat goes off to her. But China's a big country, and almost anything you say about her is right somewhere in China. We've sponsored people to go in to talk to the underground church. And what Christians in the underground church in China tell us, not American missionaries, but Chinese Christians, what Chinese Christians tell us is that they have to be in the underground church because, first of all, they insist on preaching to children, those under the age of 18, and the Chinese government does not legally permit that. And they insist on preaching about the second coming of Christ, which, of course, is a central tenet of the Christian faith. There is something, in my view, deeply wrong with saying that any government can regulate the content of the faith that can be practiced in their country. American missionaries in China have a particular problem and a particular burden. They want, understandably, to have access to China on a continuing basis. And I'm afraid sometimes that makes them perhaps a little too forgiving of Chinese oppression. They know that if they criticize China when they come back to the United States, they may not be allowed back into the country the next time they're there. I'm glad there are missionaries in China, but I believe the Christian faith and other faiths will grow in China without American missionaries. That in fact there are millions of Christian Chinese who are serious about their faith and even in the face of oppression will insist on practicing it. And I believe we have a moral obligation as the United States to stand with those people and to speak up for them and to demand that they be treated fairly and be accorded the same rights to worship that free men and women enjoy all around the world.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Please, last question.
Hi, my name is Sally Seaver, and
Hi.
I'm not a Harvard student. I'm a working professional in the area.
Great.
This goes to China, my question. So far, I've seen the debate on China posed in terms of human rights values versus economic interests. And I'm wondering what you think the chances are that business people can be convinced that through bribery and graft and so forth, that they're really never going to make the profits that they think they're going to be able to make. And that the entrenched corruption in the Chinese government, and given their values which I won't get into, but we have some feel for the fact that they're not necessarily in favor of U.S. businesses having their way globally. To really get them to see that the economic interest really isn't as strong as what they really think it is.
I think you're touching on a really important issue. You know, there's always been this thought of great promise in the Chinese market. American corporations for years have been thinking that this was nirvana. You know, they look at 1.2 billion Chinese and they imagine selling them 2.4 billion Q-tips. But the promise never seems to arrive. And one of the reasons it never arrives is that the Chinese government does play hardball. One of the things it insists on, for example, when an American company invests in China, is that that American company share its technology. And of course, the Chinese steal the technology, and there's been a long record of eventually booting out American and Western companies and then taking the stolen technology and using it to manufacture the goods themselves. These are not pleasant people. They are not people that are honorable at the end of the day. And quite frankly, I think a lot of American corporations are being plagued for suckers. I've also run into another phenomenon. I've had American corporate presidents and CEOs say to me, look, Gary, you've got French companies going in, you've got German companies going in, you're really putting a burden on us. And my response to that is, well, you know, you're not a French company. You're not a German company. You are an American company. And to the extent that the world wants your products, it is because of what America stands for and our values and our most deeply held beliefs and the courage of our young men that made the world a safe place for American companies. And I would hope that in some of these mornings, some of these corporate presidents would get up and not only say to themselves, wow, I'm the president of this company and I have to do such and such, but would actually get up in the morning and say, I am the president of an American company, and I am an American citizen. Sure, I care about my shareholders, but I also care about my country. And if there is a conflict between the two, I will stand with my country.
Are you prepared to make the self-interest?
Please finish.
Are you prepared to make the self-interest argument, though, to these companies in your pledge towards supporting China?
Absolutely. You will be hearing a lot from me in the months ahead on this issue, I can assure you. Let me just thank everybody for being here, for your great questions, for the civility of the discourse, including from those who disagree with me on a number of issues. It was a great discussion, worthy of a great place like Harvard, and I look forward to coming back and being with you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First, let me thank you all for your questions and comments, and as Gary said, for the civility with which they were offered. Let me thank Gary Bauer for joining us this evening, and that concludes this forum. Make your way home safely. Good night.